Today we're going to be talking about Aristotle's conception of happiness, and more generally, his answer to the question of what kind of person I ought to be. Ultimately, my goal is to be happy. But to explain what that is no easy matter. And to explain what it means about the way I ought to live is also no easy matter. So I think it's important that we examine the details of Aristotle's account. Many contemporary ethicists remain Aristotelian in their approaches, and his general strategy of virtue ethics remains one of the chief approaches to ethical questions in general. So we're not just engaging in historical study here, we're really looking at the person who starts a tradition that continues across the centuries and is vibrant and very active today. In fact, you might say that on the contemporary scene, there are more virtue ethicists than there are devotees of any other particular approach to ethical questions. So Aristotle continues to have an immense influence. Well, what does he say about happiness? It's going to be critical to his entire ethical theory. Aristotle was the most famous student of Plato. So Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, whose significant achievements were not in philosophy. But in any case, Aristotle began a school, just as Plato began the academy. Aristotle began the Lyceum, which was devoted heavily to the study of the natural sciences as well as to philosophy. Aristotle's greatest work is the Nicomachean Ethics, and it begins with an inspirational statement. Every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit is thought to aim at some good. And for this reason, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. Well, inspirational, yes, but logical, it's actually a little bit puzzling. He seems to be saying this: everything aims at some good. Therefore, the good is that at which all things aim. Now, at first glance, that's kind of weird. Every archer, let's say, aims at some target. Therefore, the target is what every archer aims at. Well, I guess, but there are different targets for different archers. Doesn't mean they're all aiming at the same thing, so that's a little peculiar. It gets worse if we think about things of similar logical forms, something like this. Every student seeks a degree. Therefore, the degree is what every student seeks. Or even worse, every human being has a mother. Therefore, the mother is that which every human being has. So, well, we have different mothers. People aim at different degrees. Archers aim at different targets. There's something very strange going on here. Well, you could accuse Aristotle of committing a fallacy, but I don't think that's what he's doing. He's giving you an argument that takes you from one to the other. He's not expecting you to say, oh, sure, that follows. Instead, he then proceeds to explain why there has to be one good thing that all things aim at. So it isn't really just a logical fallacy. He's saying everything aims at some good. And then if we start thinking about the nature of these goods that things aim at, we'll see that in the end, everything must be aiming at a single good. So how does it go? Well, let's start with a distinction that is fundamental to the early sections of the Nicomachean Ethics. The distinction between instrumental goods, goods that are desired for the sake of something else, and intrinsic goods. They're desired for their own sake. There are lots of examples of instrumental goods. They are desired for the sake of something else. They're tools, basically, instruments. So I desire chalk because I want to write, for the sake of writing. And the same thing with pens and pencils. I don't seek them for their own sakes. I don't just collect chalk or collect pencils or something. I seek them for what they can do. I want them for the sake of something else. A friend's father once told me, look, I don't care about money. I just care about the things money can buy. He's saying money is an instrument. It's a tool for getting what I want. It's not the end itself. But some things are really intrinsically good. We desire them for their own sake. Health might be like that. I desire to be healthy for its own sake. Being healthy is a good thing. I might enjoy pleasure, and that's good for its own sake. It's not that I desire pleasure because it's good for something else. And there might be a variety of other things like that I desire for their own sake. I just value them because I think they're valuable. Maybe listening to music is like that. You might say, well, music, I don't get it. What's it for? Indeed, I have a friend who thinks that way about music. Just, I don't get it. What's it for? What does it do for you? Well, it doesn't have to do anything for me. It's not an instrument. It's not a tool for something. It is instead something that I value for its own sake. And so lots of things like that. Art. In fact, there's this phrase, art for art's sake, music for music's sake, and so forth. These things are things that people tend to value for their own sake. If we draw a diagram of this, we can say that we can categorize things in different ways. And there's one more categorization we need, really. Aristotle introduces a special term for some of these intrinsic goods, for some of these things that are desired for their own sake. He calls some of them final. He says we call final, without qualification, that which is always desirable in itself and never for the sake of something else. So some things we desire for the sake of something else, some things we desire for their own sake. Sometimes there are things that we value in both ways, but there are some things also. In fact, he thinks there's exactly one thing that we desire always for its own sake, never for the sake of something else. So we can draw the diagram this way. Some goods are intrinsic goods. We value them for their own sake. Others are instrumental goods. We value them for the sake of something else. Some things are valued in both ways. We value them both in themselves and for what they can do for us, for the sake of something else. In fact, health is a good example of an intrinsic good that's like that. I desire health partly for its own sake. I want to be healthy, but partly also for what it can do for me. I am better at being able to do everything I want to do if I'm healthy instead of sick. And indeed, if I get sick, I might be frustrated, not only because being sick is bad in itself, but because it keeps me from doing the things I want to do. I might say, oh, I feel too sick to work. I feel too sick to teach today. I feel too tired to read that book or to take a walk or to do whatever it is that I wanted to do. And so health is something I value partly for the sake of something else. It helps me accomplish whatever I want to accomplish, but also for its own sake. And there might be a variety of things like that. In fact, Aristotle will say virtue is actually like that. We value virtue for its own sake, but we also value it for what it can do for us. And many things have that sort of character. We value them partly for their own sake, but partly for the sake of something else. I might say about music, for example. Yes, I value music for its own sake, but I also find it relaxing. I find that playing music is something that frees my mind up and lets me get away from other things and relaxes me and enables me to sort of reset my mind. It's like sort of rebooting my mind. That's something that is, well, then I value it for its own sake, but also for the sake of something else. So it's in that middle category, the overlap of the circles. The things that are always valued as instruments, never for their own sake, we can call those purely instrumental. They're mere tools. But what about the things on the other side? The things that are always valued for their own sake, never for the sake of something else? Those things are the intrinsic goods that he calls final. Those are never in that intersection. They are always valued because they are valuable, not because they lead us to something else valuable. Now, he does give us an argument here, and it's a kind of complicated argument in a way, but we've talked some about the structure of infinite regress arguments, and once you see that, you look at what he's saying, and he says, oh, basically, just use that argument, and it will lead us to conclude not all goods can be instrumental goods. They can't all be for the sake of something else, because if we value this for the sake of that, and that for the sake of this, and this for the sake of that, and so on, that can't surely go on to infinity. It's got to stop somewhere. And where it stops is not itself going to be an instrumental good. So there have to be intrinsic goods. But then we can say, well, now let's think not just about all of the things that we value for its own sake, or for the sake of something else, but let's think about the things that, well, we value instrumentally. Maybe not just purely for their own sake, but for the sake of other things as well as themselves. Then there's a similar pattern. We value them for their own sake and also for the sake of something else. There's got to be something outside that group, because that can't go on to infinity. So in the end, it must be the case that there are things we value for their own sake and not at all for the sake of something else. Those chains have to stop somewhere. And so we can go through this in detail right now if we want, but I'll just put the slide here. You can examine it if you want to. I won't go through all the details. The idea is simply those chains of being for the sake of something else can't go on to infinity. At some point you stop in something that is valued for its own sake or valued purely for its own sake. Always valued for its own sake, a final good. So he does have an infinite regress argument, both for the existence of intrinsic goods and also for the existence of final goods. But now, is there one of these? Aristotle admits it looks like many of the arts, actions, inquiries, sciences we have are directed at different ends. It would appear that indeed we're aiming at different targets. As there are many actions, arts, and sciences, he says, their ends also are many. The end of the medical art is health, of shipbuilding, a vessel, of strategy, victory, of economics, wealth. So why would we think there's one final good? Maybe health is a final good, so is a ship, so is victory in a military conquest, or in any kind of contest, you might say, in any kind of competition. Victory is valued for its own sake. And similarly, wealth. You might think, yes, people value wealth partly for what it can do for them, but to some extent, they value prosperity itself. They value wealth not only as a way of getting what they want or as a safety net of avoiding what they don't want, and actually I think that's far more important probably, but also it's a question of, well, to some extent, wanting that state of prosperity for its own sake. So people can direct things at these ends and value them for their own sake. But now, why don't we say that's final? They're valued for their own sake, period, not for the sake of something else. Well, is there anything that a ship, health, victory, and wealth are directed toward? Is it always just a matter of them being valued for their own sakes, or are they ever valued for the sake of something else? Aristotle says they are valued for the sake of something else. What is that thing? Well, why do we care if we win a battle? Why do we care if we have a ship? Why do we care if we're healthy? Why do we care if we're wealthy, or if we have at least some level of material prosperity? Yeah, partly we enjoy those states themselves. We can admire the ship and say, that's an awesome ship, and value the ship for its own sake. But we also use it for things, right? It's good for something. Well, what might it be good for? Maybe taking us somewhere or bringing goods to us? And why do we care about that? Well, those chains end somewhere. And Aristotle says if we trace them out, they all lead to the same place. Now, why should we think that's true? Here's his explanation. Politics appears to be the master art, for it is this that ordains which of the sciences should be studied in a state and which each class of citizens should learn, and up to what point they should learn them. And we see even the most highly esteemed of capacities to fall under this: strategy, economics, rhetoric. Now, since politics uses the rest of the sciences, and since again it legislates as to what we're to do and what we're to abstain from, the end of this science must include those of the others, so that this end must be the good for man. The fundamental science, in other words, Aristotle's saying, is political science. And what is its goal? It is the good of the human community, good of us, not as isolated individuals, but good as we live together, the good of the human community. Now, when you think about that, you think, well, okay, in other words, he's saying, why do we care about winning that battle? Because it's good for our community. It's good for us. And why do we care about having that ship? It's good for us, right? It improves our lives. Why do I care about being healthy? It improves my life. Why do I care about being prosperous or being effective in speaking? It makes my life better. It makes our lives together better. And so Aristotle says, all of these are directed at the good for mankind. All of these are directed at what makes for a good and successful, excellent, in fact, human community. But what is that thing? Well, that's an interesting question. He says one thing is always desired for its own sake, and never for the sake of something else. What is that thing? Happiness. We want our community to be happy. We want the individual people within it to be happy. And building the ship, winning the battle, being prosperous, being healthy, all of those things that are contributing toward happiness. My happiness, our happiness. That's what we ultimately care about. We care about our happiness as individuals and our happiness as a community. It's all directed toward the human good, which is happiness. Aristotle says one thing is always desired for its own sake, never for the sake of something else, namely happiness. So that is the one final good. Both the general run of men and people of superior refinement say that it's happiness and identify living well and doing well with being happy. An important note here on Aristotle's method. He tends to look at what people in general tend to think about an issue, and then also those who have reflected on it, spent more time. He doesn't just go with the opinion of common people, but he does start there, and he does take the common opinion into account. He also looks at the opinion of the experts, and he notes where they disagree, and then he deliberates about who's right, who's wrong. Maybe they're both wrong and we need a different account. But he takes both very seriously, and I think that's an important element of the method. In any case, he said, but look, ask the man on the street, what do you ultimately care about? The answer is happiness. Ask the person of refinement, the person who has reflected on the nature of politics, on our lives together, on ethics, and so on. They're going to say it's happiness. Well, the Greek term for this is eudaimonia. And it can be translated, and usually is translated as happiness, but it tends to mean something broader than our term happiness. It really means something like living well, flourishing, thriving. After all, our happiness tends to be transitory. That is to say, for us, the concept of happiness is something that kind of comes and goes. Are you happy? Well, I might mean something broad by that, like in general in my life. But sometimes I think, well, actually, I woke up this morning, I didn't sleep well, I woke up kind of stiff and sore, not feeling that great today. And in that kind of case, it's like, well, today I'm happy, tomorrow I'm less happy, and so on. Aristotle doesn't mean that. He means something like, are you living well? Are you flourishing? Are you thriving? I have a friend from grad school days who, when he sees me, throws up his arms and says, Daniel, are you flourishing? And he, as you can tell by that question, he's an Aristotelian. He's saying, are you happy? In the sense of, are you living well? Are you thriving? Are you flourishing? How is your life going? And so it's not, how are you today? It's rather, how are you this decade? How is your life progressing? Now, what do we need to flourish? What do we need to live well, to thrive? It's more than just pleasure at the moment or health at the moment or something like that. It's something that does require external goods, but it requires a lot more. Now, in Plato, it requires a balance of the soul. But in Aristotle, it isn't that simple. It requires, yes, internal states, like a balance of the soul, like a virtue, and so forth, but it also requires a certain level of prosperity. He says, if I'm starving to death, I'm going to have a very hard time being happy and living well. It requires a certain amount of luck. If a disease has struck and killed all the people I love, that's horrible, and I'm going to think, man, I'm not living well at all. I'm not flourishing. And it's not my fault. It's not some internal flaw, the imbalance of the soul. It's just bad luck. It requires love. It requires friendships. It requires human relationships and lots of other things that are external to us. So Plato tends to speak as if I am in control of my own happiness. Aristotle says that's not true at all. It requires, yes, that I be in control of myself in the sense that I have my head in the right place. But it also requires many things that are external to me. So can the virtuous person be unhappy? No, says Plato, but Aristotle says, of course, yes. They can be in a situation where they're starving, where their loved ones have died, where they simply have no one to love or no friends. Those are things that are difficult external circumstances, may not in any sense be their fault. Well, what is it to live well, to flourish, to thrive? Aristotle says, hard question. So let's reflect on some simple cases. When is a knife doing what it does well? When is it a good knife? Well, it's when it does knife things well, when it cuts well. What is a good eye? When is the eye doing well? Well, when it sees well. What is it to be a good teacher? What is it to be a teacher well? Well, it's to teach well, right? And so good knives cut well, good eyes see well, good teachers teach well. So just as the teacher does teacher things well, the good eye does eye things well, well, a good person does person things well. And that's going to be crucial to his account. Now, in each case, we could say, the thing is good, and it does its thing well when it fulfills its function well. So that's what we can end up saying. A good person, a virtuous person, fulfills their function well. That's what it is to live well, to fulfill your function well. Just as you do well at being a knife if you cut well, you do well at being a person if you do person things well, if you fulfill your function well. But wait a minute, what is the function of a human being? Now that's a hard question. You might worry, maybe human beings don't have any function at all. And it's hard to say, what's the purpose of human life? Difficult question. Well, here is Aristotle's approach to that. He says, think about, again, the simple cases, okay? A thing's function stems from and is intimately related to what's special about it, what distinguishes it from other things. So what makes knives special? What distinguishes them from other things? They're sharp. It's the sharpness that enables them to cut. So if their function is cutting, we tell that by the fact that they are sharp. It's the sharpness that enables them to cut. What about an eye? It's special in that it can see. And so its function stems from what is special about it, unique about it. It sees. Teachers teach. It's their ability to teach that enables them to fulfill that function. And so it's what's special about a teacher that actually then helps us to determine what that person's function is. Now, what is the function of a human being? It then depends on the question, what is special about people? What is unique to us? Not just separating us from rocks and other inanimate objects, or plants, which don't even move, or other animals, but in a sense, that's the critical question. Come as close in the animal kingdom as you want to human beings. What's special about us? What's characteristic of human beings? Something that dogs, cats, raccoons, insects, but especially apes, great apes, chimpanzees, and so on don't have. What's special about us? What makes us unique? Now, there are many things you might say in response to this. You might say, well, look, I don't think other animals build buildings. I don't think they do philosophy. I don't think they do music. I don't think they make art. I don't think they laugh or cry or do a variety of other things that human beings do. They don't pray. They don't, and we could go on with a very long list here. However, Aristotle says, here's what all those things have in common. They involve rationality. We act according to rational plans. What enables us to build buildings, to create musical compositions, to do philosophy, to simply walk down the street and go to another building, to do a variety of the things we do? We're able to plan out things, we form intentions, and we can act according to rational plans. Now, it might not be true that animals can't do this at all. Cats seem pretty good at finding their food bowl, for example, or at coercing their humans into feeding them. Monkeys are able to take boxes and pile them up to reach a banana on a top shelf. There are animals who seem to be able to construct limited plans, but they don't construct very complex plans. There are no monkey universities. There are no cat hospitals, that is to say, that are produced and created by cats as opposed to by human beings for cats. And so, in short, you might say, yeah, this planning ability is very limited. We have extensive abilities to act according to rational plans. And that's what enables us to construct religions or art or music or philosophy or science or do all the other things that seem distinctive of humanity and that other animals don't share. Well, if that is right, then you could say, well, this is the argument then that Aristotle gives. If we say that the function of man is a certain kind of life, a life of rational activity, that's an activity or actions of the soul or mind implying a rational principle. And if the function of a good man is to be the good and noble performance of these, and if any action is well performed when it's performed in accordance with the appropriate excellence, human good turns out to be activity of soul in accordance with virtue. Now that conclusion might surprise you. You might say, wait, I get it. The function of man is a life of rational activity. Well, then to be a good person is to excel in that function. And so to excel at rational activity. Well, okay, good. So the human good turns out to be excellence in rational activity. He says here, well, an activity of soul in accordance with virtue. And it sounds like that's a non sequitur. That doesn't follow at all. But it's not so. Because the term here in Greek can be translated either as excellence or as virtue. What is virtue for Aristotle? It is an excellence. It is human excellence of a certain kind. So when he says to be a good human is to be good at rational activity, our function. To excel as a human being is to excel at rational activity. Well then, that excellence in rational activity is simply virtue. That's what it is. So activity in accordance with virtue, that is activity that accords with the conception of excellence in rational activity. So that is simply the definition of virtue. Virtue is excellence. And the virtue of a knife is excellence in cutting. The virtue of a human being is excellence in rational activity. Now, if that's right, if our function is rational activity, and a good person is one who succeeds in rational activity, an excellent person is one who excels at rational activity, well then human virtue is precisely that. It is excellence in rational activity. You might infer a number of things from that, and also be a little frightened by it. It's going to suggest that excellence in rationality, as well as excellence in activity, are crucial to human virtue, are crucial to excellence in being human, and therefore to thriving, to living well, to flourishing. And that seems right. But you might also worry that it places a lot of stress on rationality and activity. And you might think some things are being left out. Wait, what happened to love? What happened to friendship? What happened to desire and emotion and pleasure and all the other things that were parts of Plato's balance of the soul? But it emerges that in the end, all of those things are things we value for their own sake. And rational activity is involved in getting the things we value for their own sake, even if they're not the one final good of living well, flourishing, thriving. Nevertheless, we do value them. And excellence involves excellence in seeking them. So actually, it's not as if pleasure, friendship, love, and those other things are left out of this life of virtue. Not at all. They form crucial parts of it. So some people have said, in fact, for Aristotle, it's less true that happiness is simply the one final good in one part of that circle of intrinsic goods. It's more like the whole, because really when we think about what that final good is, it ends up being connected to an excellence in getting all of those things that are intrinsically good. In general, acting according to rational plans that are ultimately directed at things that are intrinsically good, whether they're that ultimate final good of happiness or a more subsidiary good, like pleasure, friendship, love, honor, esteem, and a variety of other things, including self-respect or virtue itself.